In May of 1798, a young surveyor named David Thompson worked his canoe up the Ontonagon River in what is now the western Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Thompson was 28 that spring, employed by the Northwest Company, and already the kind of observer who wrote down exactly what he saw rather than what he expected to see. He would go on to map more of the North American interior than any single person of his era, on foot and by canoe, and his biographers have called him the greatest land geographer who ever lived. But on this particular afternoon, he was simply a trader following a tip. His journal records that his men told him of a mass of copper lying a short distance upriver, and that he left the canoe and walked to find it. He found it lying on a bed of limestone at the foot of a high clay bank, its upper surface smooth and rounded from centuries of water and ice, sitting dry on the shore by the time he reached it. Thompson did not fully understand what he was looking at. He knew it was copper, pure and native, roughly the size of a large table. What he did not know, and what no surveyor of his era ever fully worked out, was how long people had been coming to that stretch of river for its metal, or what the people who had lived along Lake Superior for generations believed guarded it. That question is the one this film follows. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The object Thompson recorded that day is known today as the Ontonagon Boulder, and it is not the discovery of any single man. The French Jesuit, Claude Dablon, wrote of a great mass of copper on the Ontonagon as early as 1667, describing it second-hand from Ojibwe accounts, gathered near Sault Ste. Marie. A century later, in 1766, the English fur trader Alexander Henry the Elder saw the boulder for himself and was so struck by its size that he guessed its weight at 10 tons. Thompson saw it in 1798 and recorded its dimensions with more restraint. The geologist and Indian agent Henry Rowe Schoolcraft measured it properly in 1819, describing it as scarred with the marks of stone chisels and axes, evidence that people had been chipping pieces from it for a very long time before any of these men arrived. It was finally hauled out of the riverbed and shipped to Washington in 1843, where it remains today in the collection of the National Museum of Natural History, weighing 3,708 pounds. 4 witnesses, spanning nearly 2 centuries, looked at the same object and left a written record of it. That kind of continuity is rare in early American history, and it is the reason the boulder anchors this investigation rather than any single claim made about it. What matters more than the boulder is what surrounded it. By the 1840s, when American mining companies began surveying the Upper Peninsula in earnest, expecting to find untouched wealth, they found instead that the richest native copper deposits were already worked. Pits, some of them 40, 50, even 60 feet deep, cut directly into the bedrock, followed the copper veins with a precision that ruled out random digging. Stone hammers, some weighing 30 pounds, were recovered from the bottoms of these pits, left in place as though the work had simply stopped. Wooden shaft supports and drainage channels, preserved in the cold, waterlogged ground, showed a working knowledge of how to keep a deep excavation from flooding. The federal geologist Charles Whittlesey surveyed dozens of these sites in the 1850s and published his findings in 1863. He did not claim to know exactly who had done the work or precisely how old it was. He measured what was in front of him, catalogued the tools, and concluded that the operation had been organized, sustained, and very old. Later radiocarbon testing of wood recovered from similar shafts, including sites on Isle Royale further out in the lake, returned dates ranging from roughly 3,000 to over 5,000 years before the present. None of that is seriously disputed among archaeologists today, even where the full scale of the ancient mining and the identity of everyone who took part in it remain genuinely open questions. The technique visible in the fractured rock at the working faces has a name. It is called fire setting. A fire is built directly against the rock, heating the stone until it is nearly too hot to approach, and then cold water is thrown against the heated surface. The sudden contraction cracks the rock along its natural weaknesses, and the miners break the loosened stone away with hammers to expose the copper vein underneath. It leaves a specific, recognizable signature in the shaft walls, a pattern of fire-blackened rock and fracture lines that trained excavators can identify at a glance, and it has been documented at pit after pit across the Upper Peninsula and on the more remote workings of Isle Royale further out in the lake, where surveys through the 20th century catalogued anywhere from roughly 1,000 to several thousand individual excavation features, depending on how strictly a depression in the ground is counted. It is worth being equally direct about a related and more contested claim that sometimes gets attached to this evidence. Some archaeometallurgists studying European Bronze Age copper artifacts have applied isotopic fingerprinting, a technique for matching a piece of worked copper back to the specific geological deposit it came from, and a small number of those results have not matched any known Old World source. A handful of researchers have proposed Lake Superior as a possible origin. The great majority of archaeologists working in this field do not accept that interpretation, citing gaps in the isotopic reference data and the total absence of any independent trace of transatlantic contact at that scale, and the debate remains unresolved rather than settled in either direction. A documentary account owes it to the record to mention that debate exists without pretending it has been decided. What is not contested is that fire setting itself was a real and widespread ancient technology, independently documented in the copper mines of the Sinai Peninsula, the silver workings of ancient Greece, and gold mines in Egypt, evidence that the underlying engineering problem, how to break hard rock without metal tools capable of cutting it, was solved more than once by more than one culture, working thousands of miles apart with no contact between them, which is itself a more modest and better supported point than any single claim about where a particular boulder's copper ultimately traveled. Alexander Henry the Elder, the same trader who saw the Ontonagon Boulder in 1766, was not a passing visitor to this landscape. When he first arrived at Fort Michilimackinac in 1761, disguised as a French trader out of fear of how an Englishman would be received so soon after the war between Britain and France, an Ojibwe war chief named Minwewe confronted him directly, arriving with 60 armed warriors before ultimately extending him a wary peace. 2 years later, during the uprising that swept the region in 1763, Henry survived a massacre at the fort only because another Ojibwe man, Wawatam, who had earlier told Henry of a vision in which he was to take him in as a brother, hid him and later formally adopted him into his family. Henry's own account of these years, published decades later, is detailed enough and personal enough that historians still treat it as one of the more reliable first-hand narratives to survive from the Western fur trade of that period. He was not a stranger reporting second-hand rumor. He owed his life to the people whose knowledge of this landscape he was recording. 2 years after seeing the boulder, in 1768, Henry entered into a formal partnership with a mineralogist named Alexander Baxter to mine silver out of copper-bearing rock along the lake. His own published narrative describes driving an adit, a horizontal mine entrance, into a clay bank near the Ontonagon River, working through a hard winter with a small crew, hopeful of striking a rich vein. The adit collapsed before spring, and the venture was abandoned. Henry does not record his Ojibwe associates warning him away from the ground he was digging into. What he does record is that the ancient pits scattered across that country were already thoroughly familiar to the people who lived there, treated not as a mystery but as an old and settled fact of the land, something inherited rather than discovered. Whatever had once explained those pits to the people living beside them, it was not new information to Henry's guides. It was knowledge passed down carefully enough to still matter. That inherited knowledge carried a spiritual dimension that shows up independently and repeatedly in the written record left by outsiders who had little reason to invent it, and, in several cases, no particular sympathy for native belief at all. Claude Dablon, writing from the Great Lakes Jesuit missions in the 1670s, as part of the annual reports later compiled as the Jesuit Relations, recorded an account gathered from Ojibwe informants about men who set out by canoe toward a place associated with copper, intending to bring some of it home. According to the version Dablon transcribed, the moment their canoe left shore, a voice rose from the water accusing them of trying to steal from beings who lived beneath it and considered the copper their own. Dablon was a missionary cataloguing what he regarded as pagan superstition for a European readership, not a folklorist trying to preserve it for its own sake. That he wrote the account down in careful detail, and that it aligns with what ethnographers would independently record from Ojibwe elders more than a century later, is the kind of convergence a documentary has to weigh seriously, whatever conclusion it ultimately draws from it. The being described in that account, and in nearly every written record of Lake Superior's spiritual geography, from the 17th century onward, is known across Anishinaabe communities as Mishipeshu, sometimes rendered Mishipeshu, which translates roughly to the Great Lynx. Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi oral tradition describes a hybrid creature, part cat and part serpent, with the head and paws of a giant lynx, a body armored in copper-colored scales, spikes running the length of its back and tail, and horns resembling those of a deer. It was understood as master of the underwater world and everything in it, capable of raising storms and drowning careless travelers, and it was said to make its home in the deep water off Mishipeshu Island. Belief in a powerful, dangerous guardian tied to copper and to treacherous water was not confined to the Ojibwe alone. It appears, under different names and with local variation in emphasis, among other Algonquian-speaking peoples across the wider Great Lakes and Boreal region, including communities identified in the ethnographic record as Cree, Menominee, and Shawnee, which is part of why the belief traveled as far and lasted as long as it did. Mishipeshu was understood as living in a state of ongoing rivalry with the Thunderbirds, the powerful beings of the upper air associated with lightning and storm, and Ojibwe cosmology places the two in a kind of permanent balance, one ruling the sky and one ruling the water beneath it. That balance was not treated as a passive belief. 19th century observers recorded native travelers making small offerings of tobacco to the water before setting out across open stretches of Lake Superior, a practice documented well into the 20th century among Anishinaabe communities, and separately among the prairie band of Potawatomi, who are recorded as having performed a formal ceremony to placate the underworld panther as late as the 1950s. This was not a single dramatic warning issued once and then forgotten. It was a working, living practice, renewed generation after generation, by people who traveled that water for a living and had good practical reasons to take its dangers seriously, whether or not they framed those dangers in exactly the same terms an outsider would use. What differs from community to community, and what a careful account has to be honest about, is how much of that broader shared tradition was actually set down in writing at the time, by whom, and in which specific place. Some of the oldest surviving European descriptions of Lake Superior's actual sea caves come not from missionaries but from traders working the fur routes. Pierre Esprit Radisson and his brother-in-law Médard Chouard de Groseilliers paddled the shoreline near what is now known as Pictured Rocks in Michigan's Upper Peninsula in the 1650s and 60s, and Radisson's own journal is the earliest surviving European account of that coastline. He described the sandstone cliffs there as riddled with hollows carved out by the waves, and wrote that when a storm drove the lake against them, the sound rolling out of those caverns was loud enough to resemble cannon fire. He called the shoreline beautiful and dangerous in the same breath, and he recorded, in his own words, that the native people he traveled with regarded the rocks as inhabited, alive with spirits that could not be seen but whose presence shaped how a person behaved near them. Radisson was a fur trader hunting for profit, not a collector of local color for its own sake. He wrote down what he was told because it governed how his guides handled a canoe on that stretch of water, and a trader who dismissed that kind of guidance did not last long on Lake Superior. That belief in cave-dwelling spirits along the shoreline has its own name and its own documented lineage, separate from Mishipeshu himself. Ojibwe oral tradition describes smaller water beings called Mamegwashi, sometimes recorded by ethnographers as Nebawunaubewook, said to live inside the rocky crevices and sea caves along the lake's edge, with childlike bodies, adult features, and an unsettling covering of hair. 19th century ethnographers who spent extended stretches of time among Lake Superior Ojibwe communities recorded these beliefs directly from the people who held them, not as one dramatic warning tied to a single date, but as an ordinary working part of how the shoreline was understood day to day. Offerings of tobacco before a crossing, caution around particular caves and points, care taken before landing a canoe near certain rock faces, songs sung or withheld depending on which stretch of shoreline a party was passing, none of this was treated by the people practicing it as folklore performed for outsiders. It was treated as prudent behavior on a lake that killed careless travelers with grim regularity, and the caves themselves were understood as places where the ordinary rules of the shoreline did not fully apply. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The pattern of a guardian spirit tied to a mineral deposit did not end with the fur trade era. It followed the mining industry itself into the 19th century, at a site on the Canadian side of the lake near what is now Thunder Bay, Ontario. In 1868, a rich vein of silver was discovered on a tiny island just offshore, later developed into the Silver Islet mine, which for a period became the richest silver mine in North America. The rock formation on the mainland facing that island is known in Ojibwe tradition as Nanabijo, the spirit of the deep water, said to have revealed the silver to the people living there on the condition that its location never be shared with outsiders, and to have turned to stone as a permanent guardian over the site when that condition was broken. The mine itself has its own well-documented, entirely secular history of failure. Engineers under William Frew built a stone breakwater around the tiny islet to hold back the open lake, and kept coal-fired steam pumps running around the clock to hold back the water seeping in from below, eventually sinking the main shaft more than 1,000 feet beneath the lake bed and extracting several $1 million in silver through the 1870s, at the time making it the richest silver strike on the continent. In early 1884, a delayed coal shipment left the pumps without fuel. The pumps stopped, the shafts flooded, and despite repeated attempts in the years that followed, the mine was never successfully reopened. The partially submerged shaft openings are still visible from shore today, at the foot of the long stone ridge known as the Sleeping Giant. Nothing about the coal shipment or the flooded pumps requires a guardian spirit to explain it. But the oral tradition existed before the disaster, was recorded independently of it, and the fact that the historical record and the older belief arrived at the same location from two completely different directions is again the kind of convergence worth noting rather than dismissing. The clearest physical record of the older Mishipeshu tradition, specifically, is not a journal at all. It is a rock face. On the eastern shore of Lake Superior, inside what is now Lake Superior Provincial Park in Ontario, a granite cliff called Agawa Rock rises directly out of the water, and its base carries more than 100 painted figures in red ochre, some estimated by archaeological survey to be centuries old, and a few possibly far older. The site was first documented in writing by Henry Rowe Schoolcraft in 1851, who learned its meaning from an Ojibwe chief named Shingwauk. According to Shingwauk's account, the largest and most striking image on the rock, a horned, spiked, serpent-tailed lynx, depicts Mishipeshu himself, painted beside a fleet of canoes to commemorate a war leader named Miengun, who led his people across open water during a conflict with the Iroquois and credited Mishipeshu's power for the crossing's success. Related tellings recorded around the same site, gathered from different elders across different decades, connect the painting, or a companion image nearby, to a more specific warning aimed at anyone taking copper from the lake without paying it proper respect. The details shift slightly depending on who is telling the story and when it was recorded, which is exactly what honest oral tradition looks like when multiple truthful tellings are captured over more than a century, rather than a sign that any one version is invented. The site went unconfirmed by Western researchers for over 100 years after Schoolcraft's account, until the artist and ethnographer Selwyn Dewdney rediscovered and documented it in 1958, matching what he found on the rock face to the story Schoolcraft had recorded a century earlier, almost exactly. The paint itself, a mixture of red ochre and fish grease, applied directly to the granite, has survived exposure to Lake Superior's weather for what conservators estimate may be several centuries in the oldest layers, with newer figures painted over faint traces of older ones beneath them, a rock face used and reused across generations rather than marked once and left alone. The cliff can only be approached safely from the water or along a narrow ledge at its base, accessible only when the lake is calm, which means every person who ever painted or viewed these figures had to do so at the water's mercy, a detail that gives the imagery of a lynx capable of drowning careless travelers an unusually direct and practical weight. The German-born ethnographer Johann Georg Kohl traveled among Lake Superior Ojibwe communities in the mid-1850s and published his findings in a book titled Kitchi-Gami in 1860. Kohl was a careful, methodical observer rather than a sensationalist, and his account of a conversation with a chief at Fond du Lac, near the western tip of the lake, is one of the most specific pieces of testimony in the entire written record on this subject. The chief showed Kohl a small strand of copper he kept inside his medicine bag and told him it was a strand of hair taken from Mishipeshu, regarded as an object of unusual power precisely because of where it had come from. Kohl had spent months by then living among Ojibwe families along the lake, learning enough of the language to conduct his interviews without a translator standing between him and the person speaking, and he recorded the encounter plainly, without embellishment, understanding that its value lay in exactly that plainness. A man was not performing folklore for a curious European visitor. He was showing a stranger something he privately kept and privately believed in, something tied directly to the same lake, the same copper, and the same guardian that Dablon had documented nearly 2 centuries earlier, and that Radisson had brushed up against a decade before that. It is worth being precise here about what the historical record actually supports and what it does not, because that distinction is the entire difference between an honest investigation and an invented one. There is no single surviving 18th century document in which a Cree community formally warns fur traders about caves beneath the Great Lakes on one specific dated occasion. No such record has surfaced in the surviving journals of the Hudson's Bay Company, the Northwest Company, or any Jesuit mission archive, and a careful account has to say so plainly rather than imply otherwise for the sake of a tidier story. What the record does contain, running from Radisson in the 1650s, through Dablon in the 1670s, Henry in the 1760s, Thompson in 1798, Schoolcraft's transcription of Shingwok in 1851, Kohl's transcription of the Fond du Lac chief in the 1850s, and Dewdney's confirmation of Agawa Rock in 1958, is something arguably more durable than a single dramatic incident. It is close to 3 centuries of independent, cross-checking testimony recorded by missionaries, traders, surveyors, and ethnographers who had little contact with one another and no shared motive to invent the same story, all converging on the same body of water, the same metal, and the same belief in a guardian who lived in the deep water and along the caves at its edge. That belief was never the exclusive property of one nation. It moved, as beliefs tied to a shared and dangerous landscape often do, across Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, Menominee, and Cree communities alike, carried along the same travel and trade routes that carried the copper itself, shifting slightly in name and emphasis as it crossed from one language and one territory into the next, but remarkably consistent in its core shape wherever a written record happened to catch it. It is also worth understanding why so much of that record sat unread for so long, because the reason is more mundane than dramatic. American anthropology in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was actively working to establish itself as a rigorous academic discipline, and part of that project involved a growing institutional caution toward oral testimony generally, treated as folklore to be catalogued rather than as historical evidence to be weighed alongside a written journal. Cole's transcription and Schoolcraft's transcription both sat in published volumes that were available in research libraries for well over a century. No archive restricted access to them, and no institution suppressed them. They were simply filed under folklore rather than history, read by specialists in one field and rarely cross-referenced by specialists in another, and it took later, more collaborative approaches to ethnohistory, treating documented oral tradition and the written colonial record as equally weighted evidence, for anyone to line these separate accounts up against each other and notice how consistently they agreed. What an honest documentary owes its audience at this point is restraint rather than certainty. The ancient mine pits, scattered across the Upper Peninsula and Isle Royale, are real, and archaeologists continue to debate their full age, scale, and the identity of everyone who worked them, without needing any dramatic outside explanation to make the labor itself remarkable on its own terms. The Ontonagon Boulder is real, sitting today under glass in Washington, its surface still marked by the tool strikes of people who worked it centuries before Thompson ever found it lying dry on a riverbank. The spiritual tradition surrounding Lake Superior's copper, its silver, and its caves is real, documented independently across nearly 300 years by observers who were not collaborating with one another, and it deserves to be reported with the same care given to any primary source, not flattened into a single tidy warning attached to a single tidy date, simply because that would make for a cleaner story. This is also why the framing a story is given matters as much as the facts inside it. A headline promising a single dated warning about caves beneath the Great Lakes will always travel further than an account that says, honestly, that no such single document exists. But the honest version is the more remarkable one, if it is given the chance. 3 centuries of independently recorded testimony, agreeing on the same lake, the same metal, and the same guardian, without ever being assembled into one dramatic incident, says more about how deeply this belief was held than any single manufactured warning ever could. Return for a moment to David Thompson on that riverbank in May of 1798. He would spend the following decades surveying an almost unimaginable stretch of the continent, producing a map of the Canadian West so accurate that later government cartographers used it largely unchanged for generations. He died in Montreal in 1857, nearly blind, deeply in debt, and largely forgotten by the institutions he had worked for, his personal journals sitting unpublished in an archive for decades after his death, before historians recognized what they actually contained. He had no way of knowing, on that riverbank in 1798, that he was one entry in a chain of witnesses stretching back more than 100 years before him and forward more than a century and a half after. He measured what he could see, wrote it down without embellishment, and moved on with his survey. He did not record any warning from his guides about caves beneath the lake, and an honest account cannot invent one for him simply because the date is convenient. But the ground he stood on, and the water beside it, had already been described for generations, by Jesuit priests, by fur traders who owed their lives to the people who told them, and by the people themselves, as ground that was watched. The boulder Thompson found dry on the shore, that spring still sits in a museum case today, 3,000 miles from the riverbank where he measured it. The pits above Ontonagon and out on Isle Royale are still there too, filled now with moss and the roots of trees that have grown undisturbed for a very long time. The submerged shafts at Silver Islet still sit under the lake at the foot of the sleeping giant, exactly where the 1884 flood left them. And the caves along the pictured rock's shoreline, the ones Radisson heard roaring like cannon fire more than a century before Thompson ever set foot on the Ontonagon, are still cut into the sandstone by the same restless water that has always made this lake worth approaching with some care, whatever any given traveler, then or now, believes is waiting inside them. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.